All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I am the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and I've recorded more than 5,000 interviews going back to 2003, all of which are available at scotthorton.org. You can also sign up for the podcast feed. The full archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, introducing Sam Jacobs from ammo.com. And he's got this really important article. It's called The Oregon Standoff, Understanding Lavoy Finicum's Death and the Management of BLM Land. Welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Good, man. Thanks for having me. I'm actually on BLM land right now.
Oh, well, that's good. Or bad. Not sure. Are you homesteading it and privatizing it?
No, I am I'm a vagabond, and I'm currently on BLM land.
All right.
Which is where I am a lot of the time.
All right, so remind us about the Bundy family, and it really is two different stories here, one 2014, one 2016, but just catch everybody up a little bit about who and what we're talking about here.
Yeah, so not everyone, and certainly not a number of your listeners, I'd imagine, but people tend to kind of conflate two different actions taken by the Bundy family. So the first one in 2014 was the standoff between Clive Bundy and federal officials in Nevada, which was over right fees on BLM land. And then there is this where, like, I would argue that the Bundys pretty much won that. And then in 2016, there's a totally different standoff involving his son, Ammon Bundy, and that was at the a National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon, and that was the one that resulted in the death of Lavoy Finicum.
Right. Okay. So, well, go ahead and
the reasons
tell us
for that are the reasons for the occupation in Oregon are much more opaque than the one in Nevada. The Nevada one is very, very straightforward. He didn't want to pay his grazing fees, and I don't say that like pejoratively, like he should have paid them or anything like that. It's just he didn't want to pay money that the federal government said that he owed them, and that's is pretty much the elevator pitch reason for the standoff. The reason for the standoff in Oregon is way more complicated.
Mm-hmm. Well, and on the Nevada one there, real quick, you mentioned that they pretty much won that one, and that was really, I think people may not know this. It didn't get nearly as much coverage as the whole standoff and everything. It was months later, maybe even more than a year later, that the judge ruled that all the charges were dismissed with prejudice because the government had lied about the extremely important fact that they had ringed this guy's property with snipers. And that was the reason that they had called in the militia in the first place, and that the government had lied about that. And luckily they didn't blow anybody's head off, but they had lied to the court about that, I guess. And when the judge found out about that, she angrily dismissed all the charges completely. And so, this was it was a big kind of moment for the culture wars in America, where everybody on the right is supposed to side with them and everyone on the left is supposed to hate them or something like that. And yet, at the end of the day, a federal judge let them all walk because of the abuses of the federal cops in that case.
Right, which is what they always do. I mean, and you'd think that at some point they would learn that
the abuse, not the letting them go because of it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. You'd think that they would learn at least from the fact that they're not that they lose over these things, or that they get humiliated in front of Congress or the Senate or something. I mean, I recently wrote something for Ammo about the Waco, the siege of Waco and Mount Carmel, and it was like, I'm watching these Senate hearings, and it's these ATF guys are just getting roasted by senators. So, and it's always over the same sort of thing. It's like, you lied to us, and this is like the one thing that you're really, really, really not supposed to do. But yeah, they get caught doing it every time, and that's kind of what I mean is you think they'd learn is like, you'd think that they'd learn that they're not actually very good at lying, but they don't, and so.
There's no accountability, right? Like the closest you would ever get to accountability is that their target is let go, but they don't ever have to go to prison for what they've done. So
no,
even for lying to a judge's face,
there's never any accountability. I mean, that's the thing, that no matter how many of these things I write for Ammo, and no matter how kind of jaded I get about the topic, that I just can't believe that there's no accountability whatsoever.
Yeah, especially for federal police.
Right.
In fact, there was. Go ahead.
They are the most protected class in this country, is federal law enforcement.
Right. A local sheriff's deputy sometimes will be made an example of. I mean, it's rare, but it does happen. But in fact, there was a report by the FBI about how they had justified every single shoot by an FBI agent for the last 50 years, something like that. There were no exceptions.
Well, this is a thing that I get into kind of repeatedly when I go on podcasts is, there's a very sharp difference between federal law enforcement, and county sheriffs in particular. I don't think that it's necessarily, I think that the difference between federal law enforcement and state and local law enforcement as pertains to what we're talking about now is mostly one of degree. But relatively speaking, sheriff's offices tend to have pretty clean hands and tend to be more interested in taking care of their own. I don't know why. I suspect that it has something to do with the fact that they're elected. But it shows up again in this case, where in the occupation in Oregon, the feds are constantly ratcheting up the tension, and the local sheriff's department and the state, the state police as well, but the local sheriff's department are the ones holding town halls, or the ones kind of trying to, see what they can do to get some kind of peaceful resolution out of this. And it's, again, a trope that you see again and again and again when you get into these, XYZ versus the feds thing is the local sheriff's departments tend to, actually kind of be representing the people that they're ostensibly designed to protect.
Well, on a sliding scale anyway, yeah. All right, so let's talk about this Oregon standoff. And as you say, it was less clear cut in the first place what was even going on there. It started with an arson case, is that right?
It's a really complicated arson case that, is difficult to really make heads or tails of. There's different accounts, but I think that kind of the salient fact is that the guys pled guilty to get other charges dropped, which I think that, I don't think that makes them guilty.
This is a father and son, Dwight and Stephen Hammond, right?
Right. So I don't think that, obviously, if you plead guilty to get other charges dropped, you're maybe not quite so guilty as you're being pointed out to be, but you're also maybe not quite so not guilty either. And what is interesting about this case is that these guys, they served time. A judge resentenced them, which, I don't really know how that works constitutionally, or even in a sort of broader Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence way, like resentencing somebody sounds like something.
Slow down a sec here, because you're saying that this is, in the article you talk about how they had been released and then they were re-sentenced and sent back to prison, right? So that's pretty unprecedented sounding anyway.
Yeah, like I say, it sounds like something out of, if anybody's seen Midnight Express, the movie from the 80s about the guy who goes to Turkish prison. It not only sounds alien in terms of, America's Constitution, but it sounds really alien in terms of just a longer history of Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence that our legal system is based on.
Sorry, but on the arson case, I forget now, it's been a couple of years and I just hadn't prioritized this, but was there something fishy about the case against the father and son in the first place? Or you seem to be implying there by your previous statement that you think they actually had started the fire. Is that right?
Honestly, I didn't dig that deep into that because I didn't really think that their actual guilt or innocence was as important. And I didn't, and I like, wanted to focus on the occupation.
Mm-hmm.
But I got the sense that, all right, so this is somebody can correct me, right? But the sense that I got was they started, doing controlled burns, but they weren't actually very controlled. And the issue, as I understood it, kind of became, it was less that they were doing controlled burns and more that they were not terribly good at controlling their controlled burns that got them into trouble with the feds.
Mm-hmm. But they hadn't destroyed any private property or hurt any people or burned up anybody else's cattle or anything like that.
Not as far as I know. So I mean that's an important point too, that like, I mean, you have to kind of balance these things. On the one hand, nobody's hurt, where's the crime? On the other hand, you can't just kind of let people who don't know what the hell they're doing start, burning down parts of public land.
But what it really caused a controversy here was they had done their time. They got out, and then it wasn't new charges. It was just the judge re-sentenced them and put them back in prison.
Yeah, that was kind of the thing that I thought was most, that's why I focused on that. It was kind of the most interesting thing to me because again, it's like,
and this is what caused all the militia guys to come out and try to intervene, right?
It wasn't all the militia guys at first, and it's also interesting because the local 3%ers did not join the occupation, and there was other local militia groups who did not join the occupation. They kind of had the backs of the occupation in a sense, but they were not in favor of the occupation, which I think is an important point. And I also think that I mean the guys who were the father and son who were convicted for arson like met with Ammon Bundy and his group beforehand and basically said, we don't really want your support.
Even before the whole thing had started, they had said, we don't want your support. That's interesting. Okay.
Right. They did, like, before he met with them beforehand and they basically said, we don't want your support. And, this is one of those things that, like, I feel like people don't like to hear, but these are out of town, Ammon Bundy is not from Oregon. And nor, and his people largely, as I understand it, and somebody can correct me, are not locals, which I think is not an unimportant point in this telling of the story.
Yeah.
And I don't want to go too far in the other direction either and say, well, they're these out of town rabble rousers and they kind of get what they deserve, because that's not what I think. But I do think that, them being, for lack of a better term, out of town rabble rousers is not, just kind of a footnote to this whole thing, that it's important.
Well, and it cuts both ways too, right? I mean, and the article's saying that essentially what they did worked, and that these guys got out of prison. Eventually, Trump pardoned them. And
right.
Because of all this pressure that they had helped to create. Well, at the same time, it was kind of, could be counterproductive for local politics and all this kind of thing. The fact that the local militias didn't want to participate in it would seem to say, probably on first guess anyway, that they really didn't believe in what these guys were doing or think what they were doing was justified. And you talk about how they were pretty heavy-handed with the local population, being as pushy as can be instead of as polite as can be, coming from out of town supposedly to help them and that kind of thing. So, all parts of the story are important from either side.
Right, and that was the thing that there was reports of, was like the out-of-towners being very aggressive towards the locals and, kind of demanding in very inappropriate ways they pick a side. This is an area where people were starting to open carry, and open carry is not sort of the norm there. And, I'm not obviously saying anything bad about open carry, but, it says something that the people in this town who did not feel the need to carry weapons, as a general rule, all of a sudden feel like, oh, I need to carry a gun to go to, to go to the supermarket in this little town where, cattle outnumber people 14-1. And I think that the lesson there is less about like, like locals only kind of thing, and more about how you should interact with locals when you are not one of them. I'm certainly not suggesting that any cause that isn't taken up by the locals should just be ignored by people 500 miles away. What I am suggesting is that if you are an out of towner, you are, it's kind of incumbent upon you to be extra polite, to be extra deferential. And that does not seem to be the case. I mean, we got a comment on one of the places that this was posted about how, people brought them food, and like, I'm sure that happened. I'm sure that there are cases of solidarity between the locals and the occupiers who are from out of town. I'm not denying that any of that is the case. But there are reports of sort of tensions between the locals and the out of town occupiers.
Although people should understand too, though, that unlike the impression they might have gotten from watching CNN about it or something like that, this wasn't a violent takeover of this. Was a national park facility or whatever it was there. It was empty when they occupied it, right?
Refuge. Yeah, it's not like they went and took over the local state park where kids are camping or something.
Yeah, and held a gun to the local park ranger's head and this kind of deal.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's the thing too, is I want to be very, very clear that I am in no way saying that any of the violence, any of the state-sponsored violence that befell the occupiers was something that they had coming. It is not what I think. I just am trying to present a more sort of nuanced view of what happened there. And as you said to me in an email, I think that kind of the most important fact of this is that the hostage rescue team are the ones who opened fire first.
Yeah. Well, and so that's actually kind of all I know about it, really, was I knew that this guy Finicum had been murdered in this, the incident that had happened on the road there. And there was video of it. It was a little bit hard to see what had happened in the video. And then it came out, I think, more than a year later that the hostage rescue team sniper, and big surprise, admitted that, okay, yes, it's true. He had fired the first shot when the guy got out of the truck. So that's kind of fast forwarding a little bit. But that to me is sort of the salient point that essentially this guy Finicum, even if he had been wanted for murder, which he was not, but I'm just saying, made up hypothetical, this is a fugitive. He gets out of his car with his hands up and the FBI sniper opens fire on him. And then they say that in response to that, he started reaching for his own gun, and then the cops on the ground near him finished the job that the HRT had started. So, that, and I think this is part of one of the reasons this is so important is because at the time, back to the culture war thing, this was the Black Lives Matter movement and all that. Instead of seeing themselves in these people, were, just seeing their opposite number. And I remember arguing with this young lady saying that, listen, the Black Lives Matter ought to be rallying to these people's cause, because it's all the same thing. We're up against the cops. And then she sent me a picture of one of these protesters at the Oregon thing with a sign that says, down with the BLM, which she thought meant Black Lives Matter. And that he was saying, we were protesting in Oregon because we hate black people so much. And I said, no, dear, that's the cops, the Bureau of Land Management that are oppressing these. You think just because they're white, they have power? They don't have power. They are oppressed by the cops. Welcome to the USA. It's all of us. It's, it's the government versus the individual. That's the fight that's going on here. And there are so many presumptions and assumptions about who's on whose side and all of that. But comes right down to it, the cops fired first. Now, doesn't that sound like a familiar story no matter what color you are, or what city or state you live in this country? It happens all the time. And so now I'm going to stop soliloquying and let you tell the story of what happened to this guy.
So actually, I think it's important to kind of, since you mentioned the Bureau of Land Management, it's maybe like important to back up a minute and explain where Bureau of Land Management land comes from and why it is Bureau of Land Management land.
Just so you know, we got 9 minutes.
Oh, dang. Okay. Well, anyway, I'll make it real quick then. Bureau of Land Management land was, everybody knows about homesteading in the United States, and um, what happened to homesteading land when most people didn't take it? The government just said, this is ours now. And so there's these kind of like convoluted legal theories about the government doesn't really own it. I'm somewhat sympathetic to those arguments as arguments, but that and $5 will get you a latte. The government kind of in a sense owns whatever it says it does, because it's the biggest, bully on the block.
And you do have this great map in the article that shows all the federal land in the West, and it's the super majority of all the land in the West, right?
Right. It's the overwhelming majority of all of the land in the West, which, is I think that there's an important question as to whether or not, the federal government has the constitutional authority to just say, hey, this is ours now. So that's kind of an important thing. But in terms of what actually happened, I mean, I think that, what happened to Lavoy Finicum, I think is it's one of the reasons why I had difficulty writing this, because it's so difficult to tease out. We know that he was fired upon first by the hostage response team. But other than that, it's like we have the what the police say happened, which is unreliable is a charitable way of putting it. And then we have, really grainy dash cam and surveillance kinds of footage, which in general, I personally just make it a policy to never try and say what happened in footage like that, because I think it's impossible to know unless you're, an expert. And so it's why one of the things that I say is when people watch this video, they tend to see what they want to see. And I think that that's why I don't, want to make any judgments about what happens on videotape, on poor quality videotape. And people are certainly welcome to watch it and come to their own conclusions about it. But yeah, I mean, the kind of like short version that we know, because they admitted it, is that the hostage rescue team guy capped him. And he was fired upon, I want to say 2 or 3 times more, and 2 of them hit him. I may be, on the finer details of this, I may be missing something. But what I think is kind of even more important than that is that, like you say, he was not, being arrested for murder. He was supposed to be going on his way to a town hall that was being held again by the local sheriff, who was attempting to defuse tensions in this. And we see this is another thing that runs, the thread that runs through, Ruby Ridge and Waco, and other kinds of more obscure incidents, is that the feds tend to always just want to be turning the thumb screws on these situations that are real powder kegs, and rather than look for some kind of peaceful resolution to it, which, there are a number of ways to do, and there are a number of examples of doing it. I mean, what is the kind of, to just posit it as an example, what is the downside of just letting these guys hang out in the wildlife refuge for as long as they feel like, until they get tired of it?
They're thumbing their nose at law enforcement. Meanwhile,
right,
he's on his way to a meeting with the local sheriff.
Right, that's it. I mean, they get really, really agitated about, I mean, that's just the thing another thing that I think is different between the feds and the sheriffs is that the sheriff's departments tend to have a peacekeeping, a peace officer model of their law enforcement, where the feds have a law enforcement model. So it's about the law, the law, the law, the law.
Well, again, on a sliding scale, and when faced with a bunch of armed men who are willing to fight,
Right, yeah, and I'm not trying to, glorify the local sheriff's departments, but I do think that it's much to their credit that especially in this case, the local sheriff's departments is just like, how do we resolve this? What do we need to do to resolve this situation peacefully so that everyone can go home to their families alive? And the feds tend to be like, well, how do we show off
Yeah,
our new toys and
right.
make an example out of somebody?
Hey man, you guys are going to love No Dev, No Ops, No IT by Hussein Badakhshani. It's a fun and interesting read all about how to run your high-tech company like a good libertarian should. Forget all the junk. Read No Dev, No Ops, No IT by Hussein Badakhshani. Find it in the margin at scotthorton.org.
Hey, y'all, here's the thing. Donate $100 to the Scott Horton Show, and you can get a QR code commodity disc as my gift to you. It's a 1-ounce silver disc with a QR code on the back. You take a picture of it with your phone, and it gives you the instant spot price and lets you know what that ounce of silver is worth on the market in Federal Reserve notes in real time. It's the future of currency in the past, too. CommodityDiscs.com, or just go to scotthorton.org/donate.
Hey guys, Scott Horton here for expanddesigns.com. Harley Abbott and his crew do an outstanding job designing, building, and maintaining my sites, and they'll do great work for you. You need a new website? Go to expanddesigns.com/Scott and save $500.
In the interests of the whole story, you really do talk about in the article here, and I'm not sure exactly, how clear all this is, but it seems to be certain in your article that this guy Finicum was telling the cops who pulled him over, the state troopers who were pulling him over, that you're going to have to kill me and all of this kind of stuff. So it wasn't like he was meekly, leaving his hands on the steering wheel and submitting to their authority and whatever. He was being confrontational. They ran him off the road, and he was saying all these things that if you were a cop on the scene, you could infer that first chance he got, he was going to draw on you, and they had every reason to think he was armed. People debate whether his arm came down like he was actually reaching, for his gun or not. But again, if HRT fired the first shot, which I think in my understanding, the first shot hit the roof of the truck or something like that.
It did.
Then at that point, he has the right to defend himself. So, anyway.
If you'll notice in the article, it's I say he's reported and according to Oregon State Police. So,
okay, I didn't remember those caveats in there.
Let's
but
take all this with a grain of salt, and consider the source. But he was on.
I wasn't sure if that was on tape or what, but I'm sorry. Go ahead.
He was interviewed on MSNBC, I want to say, and when he was Tarp Man on MSNBC, I have no idea because I obviously don't watch MSNBC, but he was, I believe it was there that he said, I have no intention of spending my time in a concrete box or something to that effect. But dude, people say a lot of things. I mean, people say stuff like that all the time.
Yeah.
And
cops lie all the time too.
Right, exactly. So to what degree he's, trying to kind of, bully the police around or tough talk the police, who knows? I mean, it's so difficult. That's the thing is it's so difficult to tease out what actually happened versus what the police say versus this versus that. Yeah. But again, as you say, I think that the important point is that he was fired upon first by the sniper.
Yeah. Well, and although in this case, unlike Ruby Ridge and Waco, it wasn't Lon Horiuchi, it was a different FBI hostage rescue team sniper.
God only knows where that guy is now.
He's probably sitting on a beach, cashing checks.
Yeah.
So, but now what? Is there anything, he has any survivors suing or anything in process, anything going on?
There's all kinds of lawsuits, man. I mean, there's lawsuits against the state, there's lawsuits against the Fed, there's, it's 27 people were arrested, on both federal and state charges. I mean, there's law There's lawfare going all around.
Have they been convicted? Have any of the occupiers been convicted and sent to prison yet, or already?
4 of them were convicted in March 2017. It was mostly conspiracy to impede federal workers,
Preventing the staff of the
process crimes
of the park to show up at their job. Yeah. Although, in a way, it sounds like it could have been worse. But did they get years? Does it say what they were sentenced to for that?
It looks like they were fined.
Okay, yeah, that could have been much worse, but
$3,000, $10,000.
Yeah.
13 occupiers agreed to pay a total of $78,000 in restitution.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, I'm sorry we got to run here, but this is such a great piece and really important history. I hope people look at it. The Oregon Standoff: Understanding Lavoy Finicum's Death and the Management of BLM Land. That's at ammo.com by Sam Jacobs. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
The Scott Horton Show and Anti-War Radio can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.